Welcome back to the classroom. We're continuing our program, A Moment for Life, where we break down the pro-life argument into smaller segments so that we can better understand, better articulate, and better defend our pro-life position. Today we're going to look at how to defend against the bodily autonomy objection. In our last episode, we looked at the objections that pro-choice advocates will generally make to our pro-life argument, and the last of these objections, the bodily autonomy objection, was left for another day. Well, today is that day. Let's look at the bodily autonomy objection. The argument is basically this. The pro-choice advocate will concede that the unborn has a right to life. They will concede that the unborn is a full-fledged member of the human community. But then they will say, because of bodily autonomy of the mother, she has the right to kill the unborn. It is bodily autonomy that trumps the right to life. We see it in several forms. It's the my body, my choice. It's the a person doesn't have the right to live inside another person. A person doesn't have the obligation to let someone live inside them. A person has the right to disconnect themselves from another person who has connected with their body. All of these are just forms of the bodily autonomy argument. They all suffer from the same fatal flaw. They ask the wrong question. And if you ask the wrong questions, you get the wrong answers. Let's see how this works. Let's look at the first of these wrong questions, and that is, does a woman have a right to control her body? Well, the answer is yes, of course she does. We all do, but that's not the question. It's not the question of whether a woman has a right to control her body. The question is, does that right have any limits? And if it does have limits, is abortion one of those limits? Of course, the bodily autonomy right of a woman has limits. All of our bodily autonomy rights have limits. We can't use our body to punch someone in the face. We can't go to the supermarket and instead of using the restroom, we use aisle 4. There's a lot of things that we can't do with our body. The question now is abortion one of those limits? Remember, in bodily autonomy, there is the concession that the unborn is a full member of the human community with a right to life. In other words, is the intentional killing of an innocent human being something that bodily autonomy allows? Well, if bodily autonomy allows the killing of a human being, logic would require that it would allow the harming of a human being. Consider the drug thalidomide. It was given several decades ago to pregnant women to help them with morning sickness. The problem with thalidomide is that it caused birth defects. Children were being born without arms and legs, and the drug was discontinued. The question then is, does a woman have a right to take thalidomide to help her with morning sickness? Going one step further, can a woman take thalidomide to intentionally cause the birth defect? Maybe the woman has a reason that she wants a child born without arms or legs. Does she have the right to do that? If bodily autonomy gives her absolute control over her body, I think the answer has to be yes. But somehow we can see that that's just wrong. That it is wrong to harm the child. If it's wrong to harm the child, how can it be right to kill the child? Does a person have a right to use another person's body to stay alive? That's generally a bodily autonomy question. That's the wrong question. Of course, a person doesn't have the right to use another person's body. The question is, does a person have a right not to be killed? Because an abortion is killing. It's not merely removing someone away from your body. There is the pro-choice argument that abortion is merely a mother terminating her pregnancy by removing the fetus from her body. That's absurd. Because if that's true, then a man who kills his wife and throws her body in the trash is merely terminating his marriage and removing his wife from his house. So the correct question is, does a person have a right not to be killed? They absolutely have that right. If the right to life means anything, it means that you can't be intentionally killed when you are innocent. It's here where you're going to hear a lot of analogies. You're going to hear the famous violinist analogy, or the analogy about the fetus doesn't have the right to use the bone marrow of another person, or we don't have the right to get a blood donation from another person. You're going to see all kinds of analogies. I want to talk for a moment about argument by analogy. There is nothing wrong with analogical reasoning. It gives us great insight into moral intuition. But if we're going to use an analogy, if we're going to say abortion is right because this other situation proves it, That other situation, that analogy, has to be the same as pregnancy. In other words, it can't differ in any substantial and essential way. Of course, an analogy is going to differ, but the question is, are those differences substantial and essential? Here's what I mean by that. Think about one railroad track. Maybe it's the left track of the railroad tracks. Look at it going down the horizon, that straight line going down the horizon. That's the path of pregnancy. That's the abortion argument. That's what you're trying to work on. You're going to learn about it. You're going to argue it. You're going to build a case by using an analogy. You're going to use the right track and say the right track takes us to the same place. So therefore, those two situations are enough the same so that I can use them to prove my point. Suppose the right track is a different color. Does that difference matter? No. The train can still function even though the tracks are two different colors. If the right track was a different material, say it's a stronger steel, would that matter? No, the train will still function. But now suppose that right track is made of paper and the train collapses it. That's an essential difference. That's a substantial difference. Suppose the right track doesn't quite run parallel. It's just a little off. A little off, by the time you run it all the way down to the horizon, is a huge difference. The train is going to crash. So if an analogy is going to work, it has to run parallel to the situation that you're talking about, and it can't differ in any real or substantial way. Let's look at all of the analogies together. They all suffer from the same fatal flaw. You're going to hear an analogy that says, suppose you were hooked up to a violinist against your will, that you had the only kidney that could keep this violinist alive, and you had to stay hooked up to that violinist for 9 months. And this was done against your will. It was done while you were sleeping. Do you have a right to disconnect? Yes, you do. Suppose your neighbor needs a blood transfusion and you're the only person in the world with that type of blood. Are you obligated to give them a blood transfusion? No. These analogies differ in real, substantial, and essential ways because the analogies that you're given have two choices: help or not help. Help or not help. And if you don't help, the person is going to be in the same position they were before you came along. They'll probably die from whatever it is that made them sick. Pregnancy is not the same. The choices aren't the mother either helps or doesn't help. In pregnancy, the choice is the mother either helps or she kills. Help or kill. Let's look at how that applies to an analogy. Suppose that neighbor who needed the blood transfusion, you now have the option to either give the blood transfusion or take an axe and hack him to death. In that situation, you might have to give him the blood because we cannot kill an innocent person. We cannot take affirmative action with the intent to kill an innocent human being. That's what's wrong with all of these analogies. Let's look at another question. Does a person have the right to use another person's body to stay alive? The answer is no. No, they don't. But that's not the question. We're not talking about a person and another person. We're talking about an unborn and her mother. Of course, the fetus doesn't have the right to use just anyone's body. The question is, does the fetus have the right to use the body of her mother? The fetus does. Let's see how we get there. We're going to look at nature and we're going to look at justice, and both of them are going to take us in that direction. What do I mean by nature? I mean that nature has placed the unborn in that situation. And if the right to life, that it's already been conceded that the unborn have, if the right to life, it means anything, it means that you are entitled to those very basic things that nature intends you to have. Those very basic things nature intends you to have, and nature intends an unborn to have the resources of her mother. It's what nature has required. Let's look at justice. It is a matter of justice for every human being to have those basic necessities that nature requires. Reproductive justice, if that term is to mean anything, it has to mean justice for all the participants in the reproductive process. The mother, the father, the child, society, all of it. So in other words, does the fetus have a right to live inside her mother? Yes. Nature requires it and justice demands it. Another wrong question that is used in the bodily autonomy argument is the very simple question, Well, do you believe that bodily autonomy makes abortion permissible? You're going to get a resounding yes from the pro-choice camp. It appears that most pro-choice people believe that bodily autonomy is at least one of the reasons that makes abortion permissible. But then when you ask them about sex selection, about late-term abortions, they're going to begin to hedge. Statistics show that the vast majority of Americans agree that there should be restrictions on late-term abortions. It's interesting that many of these folks also say that they believe in bodily autonomy. These two things are mutually exclusive. If bodily autonomy trumps the right to life, it must do so throughout the entire pregnancy. Up until the moment of birth, bodily autonomy trumps the right of the unborn. Because if it doesn't, then bodily autonomy fails as a justification for abortion. The bottom line is that the bodily autonomy argument sounds good because the wrong questions are being asked. When you ask the right questions and you focus the discussion, you're going to see that my body, my choice is not a valid argument, because when you look at what the choice is that's being made, bodily autonomy cannot support that choice. As always, speak graciously but truthfully every time, everywhere. I'll see you next time in the classroom. Thanks for watching and for taking a moment for life.